It is one of the most controversial technology companies in the world. It is Huawei. They make phones, they make infrastructure, but different countries have different attitudes to them. Certain countries have banned them from building certain things. So, what are they? And can we have a conversation about whether or not they are actually dodgy? We have Daniel Van Boom, the news editor from the technology website CNET, and Ray Johnson from the National Indigenous Television Network, the science and technology editor. She's also the co-host of the Take It Black podcast. Huawei, huge Chinese technology company, but just introduce them for me, Ray.
Huawei is a Chinese technology company. They do various things, one of which is produce mobile phones. They're actually the number 2, I believe, mobile phone manufacturer in the world. So it's not a small company. It hasn't, come out of nowhere. It's been around for a very long time. They also build and provide a lot of infrastructure for building telecommunications networks. And basically, they were not able to prove back in 2012 to the US government that they could not be coerced into providing information to the Chinese government.
Was it just because everyone couldn't understand that many double negatives?
No. Basically, they said to Huawei, if the Chinese government asked for you to provide them with information about people that are using your products and services, would you do that? And Huawei went, no, of course not. And the US went, we don't believe you.
Okay.
And that's the gist of where this all began, really.
The issue at stake isn't actually the phones, it's their 5G kit, essentially. So as Ray mentioned, this has been a problem since 2012, but the reason it's more of a problem now is because we're entering the 5G era. And America is obviously kind of leading the charge on that, but it's interesting because Australia has kind of followed suit, and we've banned Huawei from installing equipment, whereas the UK has allowed them, but with a bunch of restrictions. So, for instance, Huawei is capped at 35% of the market. There are certain locations they can't build kit in the UK. And this is kind of
on top of the MI5 building?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Right.
And it's pretty effectively wedging the governments. I mean, Boris Johnson and Trump just had one of Trump's infamous shouty phone calls where Trump allegedly accused Boris of betraying him. And
bit dramatic.
Such that Boris was meant to visit the US, but he cancelled that trip.
What is happening with 5G that Huawei are involved in the first place?
We're currently mostly on 4G. 5G is the next iteration of what we're all going to be using on our mobile phones. It is a lot faster and it's going to enable us to do lots more things.
Because the big thing with 5G is it limits the ping, so the amount of time it takes for one device to send information to a satellite and get it sent back. So driverless cars, for instance, like every few milliseconds they're sending information to sensors. But we don't really know how much of it is hype, how much of it is real. The thing with Huawei, though, is that its 5G equipment is really good and really cheap. For instance, in rural America, it's up to about 30 to 40% cheaper than the competing kits from Ericsson and Nokia. American government essentially claims that Huawei is being subsidized by the Chinese government, which is why they can provide the good equipment for cheaper. And Huawei denies that claim. Sometimes people get confused in the sense that they think that the US government is specifically wary of Huawei, which I guess it is, but more generally, it's about the structure of business in China itself. So it's not like a Soviet-style kind of thing where there's like a bureaucrat in the bowels of every like company and they're saying you will sell this to this company for this price. It's more like that the way that the state interacts with the private sector in China is that if someone from the Communist Party taps them on the shoulder and says, hey, we need you to do this, they really can't say no. And that was enshrined into law in 2017. There's a national intelligence law that essentially says if the government deems something to be worthy of national security, you have to essentially acquiesce to their request.
But that's not really unlike what every government does, right? Like every government is asking for, backdoors built into encryption, which is rubbish. And, for tech companies to break their security in one way or another to expose data from people that may have committed crimes.
It's not like China is unique in that regard.
Yeah.
Although my understanding of it, there's been much more public debate about whether or not American and European tech companies will give those rights over. So famously, obviously, there was the example where the FBI wanted backdoor access built into iPhones, and Apple went no. So but I think the conversation is a bit more public. I think as more Chinese-based tech companies start to reach out around the rest of the world, it is something to be mindful of in terms of how you interact with technology, and perhaps more than just the consumer technology, how it operates on big, broad infrastructure projects, which is like building 5G networks. Google have said that they aren't going to allow their apps on Huawei's new P40 phones. Why exactly is that though, Ray?
Google is one of the companies that fell under the ruling from the US government to not interact with Huawei, basically. They're not allowed to do business with them anymore. So they are allowed to provide updates to apps installed on current phones, but with the future phones, they're not allowed to provide anything to them at all, including their own kind of like security measures that they place in phones that are certified to have Google apps in them. So even if you do get your hand on one of these phones and, you know, get the apps on there through an unofficial channel, Google are saying that, hey, we can't actually guarantee that these are secure, that they're going to work properly, that they're going to do what you want them to do, because we haven't been able to certify them and put our own security measures in place.
But people totally will be able to load those apps, like sideload them if they really want to.
If they really want to, they will be able to. But Google is saying that you can't do that. But it's more of a, you can't do that, rather than a, you can't do it.
There is lots more of this in the podcast of Download the Show. We're also talking about solar flares in the most unexpected way possible. It'll make sense when you go find a podcasting app and you do indeed download the show. See you next time.